So we say it today loud and clear as poets, as artists, as human beings. Black lives matter. And today we have a wonderful panel coming up for you. It should be pretty lively. We have Robert Archambeau, Sally Connolly, and Mark Scroggins to talk about looking back at the future of poetry. There will be a panel, there will be a Q&A. Stay tuned. Okay, now I'd like to introduce my co-host, Jonathan Penton. In 1998, Jonathan Penton founded unlikelystories.org. Since then, he has lent editorial and management assistance to a number of literary and artistic venues, such as Mad Hat Inc. and Big Bridge. He has organized literary performances and performed himself in Arkansas, California, Chihuahua, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Oregon, Texas, and Washington State and DC. His poetry books are Last Chap, Blood and Salsa, and Painting Rust, Prosthetic Gods, and Standards of Sedity and Backstories. Jonathan, are you going to grace us with some reading today?
Thank you. I'm going to read a poem that I published. Like Larissa says, I run www.unlikelystories.org. Founded in 1998, and we publish 3 or 4 writers a week on a continuous loop. Yeah, I'm very proud to have been going so long and to publish so regularly. And I'm going to read something we recently published from there. This is called Reality Apraxis, and it's by D.C. Wojcik. Reality Apraxis. 1. Vanity. I was not born flung open like this. Taste my bread, my blood, my breath. Heed those tragic years passing and slicing the air like the metal tears of looking back. Heed my song, ring the alarm, tell it back to your own third person. I found joy in the faintest and dared telling no one. I wouldn't have fled so fast except the cathedral bells are covered in my fingerprints. 2. Self-generation. Talismanically endowed, oh, who will answer for the tragedy of years? My crown of thorns hasn't yet fallen from the trees of fate. The secrets of the crowd gather around my glistening doorframe, waiting to veil their scars with memories of the scent of orange groves, transgressing stillnesses that you in the core of being slip into the dust of voices spinning from cloud thoughts and prophetic moonbeams. Purple in the windows of remorse, for willing beyond the microscopic thresholds of omniscience, out of body, out of mind, out of time. Cranial onions bring out my territorial nature. 3. Omniscience. These worlds never begin and never end. Filaments bleed in the alley, beyond nucleus of nascence. Exorcism crown coated within scavenge for abbreviation. Tilted orbit of Trismegistus, red vespers of the past, undoubtful and nodding off oxygen, destiny eclipse gaso foremost, 2 javelina eyes and oleander sniffing the light of Venus rising. Again, that's Reality Apraxis by D.C. Wojcik, and we publish it on unlikelystories.org. And I'd also like to talk about a project that I'm honored to serve on as webmaster. It's called Rigorous, and it's a journal entirely edited and written by people of color, and one white guy building a website. It's been running since Inauguration Day 2017. It was founded in response to the 2016 election, and it's edited by Rosalind Spencer and Kenning J.P. Garcia. It's a wonderful magazine, web journal at www.rigorous-mag.com. www.rigorous-mag.com. And I hope you'll go there and check it out. And I'm going to kick it back to Larissa and introduce her.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. Larissa Schmeila's new novel is Sly Bang. Her first novel is Patient Women. Her poetry collections are Medusa's Country, Special Characters, In Paran, the chapbook A Cure for Suicide, and the ebook Feb Sequence. Her poetry albums are The No Net World and Exorcism, for which she won the New Century Best Spoken Word album. Tracks are available from iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, and all digital distributors. Shmelova's work has appeared in the anthologies Measure for Measure, Words for the Wedding, Contemporary Russian Poetry, and Choice Words, Writers on Abortion. She's the original English language translator of the first futurist opera Victory Over the Sun by Alexei Krushenyak.
Yeah, Krushenyak, wonderful.
Wow, okay. Performed at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Garage Museum of Moscow, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and theaters and universities worldwide. Shmylov also edited the anthology 21st Century Russian Poetry and has been a translator on the Russian Bible for the Eugene A. Nida Institute for Biblical Scholarship of the American Bible Society. Larissa?
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to read a poem from my Unlikely Books collection, Special Characters, and I'm sending this out to Black Lives Matter. It's called Lager NYC. You volunteer, Reichsgeboren. You choose to be here, select. You volunteer, you know the difference between cause and effect. The people on the street are too stupid to have homes, too filthy to wash. See them root through the garbage, nicht essen, aber fressen, nie jeste žrať. They deserve to be there, they deserve to be there, select. Concentrate. See the dark people sitting in the cells. They deserve to be there. They deserve to be there. And the women of the Frauenblock, the Fräulein XXX, control her, detain her, pick her up, select. Cause and effect. You know which is which. Select. You volunteer. We see you on the job where you whisper half of what you think and none of what you feel. See the clock. The digital tattoo says, run now. Rush to the train, the transport. Who cares who gets in? Who cares who gets out? Push into the car, the transport. Who cares who gets home? Who cares who gets shot? Arbeit macht frei. You choose this. You choose, select. Hey, you volunteer. We find ourselves together in the subway, the Grand Case Central. Here in Case, your face is not a face. Ni лицо, a morda. Your face is not a face, but a snout. We don't eat here, we devour. Nicht essen, aber fressen. Ni jeste žrať. We don't give an inch and we don't give a damn. Only weaklings fall to the tracks. God knows the difference between cause and effect. The selection is over. Look how it happened that you fell. You choose this. You choose this. Select. It's now my pleasure. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce my co-host, Mark Vincennes, who has published 14 books of poetry, although in this week he might have published a few more, we don't know, including more recently Leaning into the Infinite, The Syndicate of Water and Light, and Here Comes the Night Dust. Vincennes is also a prolific translator and has published 10 books of translations, most recently Unexpected Development by award-winning Swiss poet and novelist Klaus Mertz, and which was a finalist for the 2016 Cliff Becker Book Prize in Translation. His work has received fellowships and grants from the Swiss Arts Council, the Literary Colloquium Berlin, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Witter-Binner Foundation for Poetry. He has the unique distinction of being nominated for 37 Pushcart Prizes. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Vincennes.
Hi, guys. So this one is freshly out of the oven. I originally entitled it Prelude to a Planet, thinking, of course, that it should be prelude to open brackets, another, comma, a new, close brackets, planet. So here is prelude to another, a new planet. Out here in the wastelands where industry broods, a dark cloud of toxic fumes pours over the day. Back in town, the earth is being dredged, exposing the shiny shells of beetles, fledgling larvae. Flies are burning up in their flying machines, seeking out dead meat, fragments of life that once were an army of empty, gleaming houses standing to attention. Truth needs no future, they seem to say, with their glaring eyes. As they hammer, the workmen bare their stained teeth. Perhaps we'll meet again in 500 years, somewhere in the swamps, in deserted cemeteries, under rusted bridges. There we can dance in a natural light or walk in the tracks of the bear along the river's narrow edge, tossing stones, knowing that we too deeply belong to the earth.
Very cool.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Maybe before we commence the featured section, we should take a few seconds to think about George Floyd and all that has happened in the nation in his last days. And now to the featured section. As you know, today we have 3 critics, 2 poets, and they will be discussing a perception, a view on what is current, what is present, perhaps what matters in terms of poetry today. Our first, I'm going to read all of these bios and give you a little intro. So our readers today, or shall we say our panel today, consists of Robert Archambeau, who is the author of 6 or 8 books, depending on how you count. He writes poetry and literary criticism, but has spent the last several months concentrating on art criticism and writing a novel. His most recent book is Poetry and Uselessness, From Coleridge to Ashbury. He teaches at Lake Forest College when he isn't huddling in his bunker. Mm-hmm. Sally Connolly is a Martha Gano Houston research professor. I think the Houston thing was right?
No, I can't say it. Martha Gano Houston. She was Howard Hughes's aunt.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Research professor at the University of Houston. Her 2016 book, Grief and Matter, is the first to consider elegies for poets as a significant subgenre of poetry, while her 2018 book, Ranches of Isolation, out from Mad Hat Press, explores recent transatlantic poetic relations. She's currently working on a book about the poetry of the AIDS epidemic. And Mark Scroggins, the magnificent, his most recent books are The Mathematical Sublime, a collection of essays and reviews, the poetry book, Pressure Dressing, and Our Lady of Pain, a selection of Swinburne's erotic poems. A chapbook, Elegiac Verses, is imminent from Above Ground, and Mad Hat Press will publish the first 50 sections of Mark's long poem, Zion Off-Ramp, next March. He writes a monthly poetry review column for Hypoallergenic Weekend. So there are 3 panelists. Marion Moore wrote, "There are things important beyond all this fiddle. In short, Black Lives Matter." In the words of Mark, Robert, and Sally, the 3 of us are white. We are aware of that privilege, and we enjoy privileges beyond those of many others, white or brown or black. We live on land appropriated from native inhabitants, and we enjoy the fruits of an economic system built on slavery. So we are all well aware of and made uncomfortable by the incongruity of our chatting about poetry in the middle of the greatest civil rights struggle of many of our lifetimes. But here we are. And here we go. And let's hope that our words today and every other day that we write, talk, publish, think, create, have that effect. We, with this talent, with this creative talent, need to express it to the world in its greatest glory. On that note, I hand you Robert Archambeau.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. Those of you who came here to hear poems are going to be terribly disappointed, although I and Mark Scroggins are culpable for the creation of poems. We are here, as is Sally, in our capacity as critics. And what we're going to be doing is this. We're going to revisit a talk I gave, it feels like a century ago, in the early Obama administration, called "You Will Object: 4 Futures for Poetry." And what I'm going to do is read an abbreviated version of that, should take about 10 minutes. And then Mark and Sally, and you can tell I have little experience with Zoom because I'm pointing to them on my screen, Mark and Sally, are going to show the flaws and the limits and the failures and the shortcomings of what I had to think about the future of poetry. And I will listen and learn from all that. So without further ado, this is You Will Object: 4 Futures of Poetry. And as a coward and an academic, if that is not redundant, I will begin with the caveat: the future is hard to predict. But with that out of the way, let me say this about the future of poetry. 2 things are certain. It will be ubiquitous and it will rhyme. Don't object yet. All right? And I'm not just talking about subtle rhyme. I'm talking about rhyme that pushes itself to the foreground and rhyme that sets out to showcase virtuosity. Almost any respectable contemporary American poet you're likely to be thinking of eschews this sort of rhyme on all but the rarest of occasions, and for a good reason. As Anthony Madrid puts it in his History of the Topic, quote, "The vast majority of perfect rhymes in English are in very heavy rotation during the many centuries of English rhyming. In order to fetch a rhyme pair that would be in any way novel in itself, a poet would have to travel a great distance, and the resulting rhyme would be very likely to have the character of a stunt." But stunts, amazing stunts, comic stunts, virtuosic stunts are exactly what the most prominent practitioners of rhymed verse in America want and achieve. Consider, for example, the words, and these words are going to be very unconvincing on me, but I want you to consider the words of Jay-Z. And I quote, "Rolling in the Rolls Royce Corniche, only the doctors get this, I'm hiding from police. Cocaine seats all white, like I got the whole thing bleached. I'm out here bawling, I know y'all hear my sneaks. Jesus was a carpenter, Yeezy laid beats. Preach." And these are, of course, the words of a rapper. And their rhymed verse is ubiquitous in our culture and certain to continue to be so well into the future. But you object. Perhaps you're thinking, that's not poetry, those are lyrics. In any case, you feel perhaps correctly there's been a kind of a sleight of hand. Yeah? I'm nothing if not accommodating. So I'm going to acknowledge and allow the objection, and I'm going to change my thesis. All right? So it's difficult to predict the future of poetry, but 2 things are certain. It will be ubiquitous, and it will be so delicately suggestive and elusive that we would be forgiven for thinking it comes straight out of Mallarmé's symbolist playbook. Consider what Mallarmé said when in 1891 he condescended to an interview with L'Echo de Paris. Right? He said, "There must only be illusion. The contemplation of objects, the images that soar from the reveries they have induced constitute the song. The enjoyment of the poem derives from the pleasure of step-by-step discovery. to suggest. That is the dream, right? Connotative nuance. That's what he's talking about. But is this sort of thing really ubiquitous in America, right? And is it our future? Yes, I say yes. Symbolist poetics are everywhere. A few years ago, they might even have been in your pocket if you used a BlackBerry to check email and make calls. By the way, this is a talk from a decade ago. I don't know if any of you remember what a BlackBerry is. It's sort of like a phone. Okay. But consider the name of that device, the BlackBerry, because the people who named it certainly did. When the marketing people at Research in Motion, which is the parent company for BlackBerry, approached David Plasek of the publicity firm Lexicon with the device, they wanted to call it the email merge. And Plasek hated that name because it offered nothing at all except for accurate description, right? What was wanted was nuance and allusion and connotation. And so we got BlackBerry, a one-word symbolist poem of great intensity. Think about this, of how the word BlackBerry brings to mind the seriousness and the sleekness of high technology associated with the word black, the most serious of colors, and the fun and freshness and happiness associated with the term berry. And one of the things I cut out of this talk right here is a paragraph about Apple and how an apple and a BlackBerry are both fruits, and how Apple was the big underdog taking on, I guess, Microsoft. I don't think people feel that way about Apple anymore. In fact, I think Jonathan, who I'm pointing to now, is radiating skepticism about Apple as an underdog company and thinking about global capitalism in negative terms. I can see it. It's doing this. Anyway, you object, right? Well, you're about to object. But I wanted to say BlackBerry is not a brand name like those of the early industrial period, when a product was called Murphy's Oil because it was oil and sold by Murphy. Right? New products don't have names like Heinz tomato ketchup. They're called things like Swiffer or Dasani, which are also products of David Plasek and the good people at Lexicon. They've systematized symbolist poetics and placed them all around us in a manner that promises to become more intense and all saturating in the market research future. Mallarmé, French symbolism. That's the future of poetry, and it'll be ubiquitous. But you object. Alan Golding in particular is objecting. He's walking around his house to find a place where he can scream, right? You object because the notion that Mallarmé has been kidnapped by PepsiCo is simply too sad to bear, right? Or maybe because you wanted to hear about art poetry, the stuff that the people in the poetry business think of as poetry. And since I am nothing if not accommodating, I will allow the objection and I will change my thesis. So this, third time. It is difficult to predict the future of poetry. Two things are certain. It will be marginal and it will become increasingly about itself. Consider the trajectory of American poetry from the Puritans through Longfellow's Hiawatha and on through modernism and beyond. If we compress that whole history into a few sentences, what we get is this. And by the way, this is even fewer sentences than I compressed it to, because this talk was 2,000 words and now it's 1,300. All right. We begin with religious tracts in verse, produced less with concern for the art of language than with the work of saving souls. And by the time we get to Longfellow, we see American poetry even more popular and with no respectable household lacking its book of largely moralizing verse. Right? It's then that we get the 20th century. And that's when things get strange in poetry in America. They get strange in England earlier. They get strange in France way early. It's more interesting. But in America, we don't get strange until the 20th century. And then poetry becomes much less about public morality and more about things particular to itself. With the more radical elements of modernism and this tradition stretching on to the language poets, we see poetry that centers not moral statements or narrative events, but language itself. And this centering becomes so commonplace in poetry that by the time you get to the middle of the 20th century, the linguist Roman Jakobson calls drawing attention to the language itself the poetic function. Like, he doesn't present that as a historically contingent idea. He presents it as a universal. That's what poetry is, draw attention to the language itself, right? And so that starts to happen. And along with this, and I don't think it's coincidental, we see the growth of a subculture specific to poetry. You know, journals that only contain poems or poems and reviews of poems, academic programs specific to poetry, people who are hired as poets, that sort of thing. And the trajectory towards specialization continues with the movement away from language itself towards commentaries on the subculture of poetry. And this is, after all, and Sally and Mark, I think this is going to leap on me later, so sharpen your claws, right? But this is leaping onto me of 10 years ago, and he was 40 pounds heavier and slow, so be nice. This is, after all, one major topic of conceptualism. Consider, for example, Vanessa Place's chapbook titled $20, which consists of 20 $1 bills stitched together, presented under her signature, and sold for $50 each. It's a commentary on what happens when something is designated poetry, probably some kind of commentary on cultural capital. It's also a lot more specialized than the poems of the Puritans in that it means the most to those who are equipped to see it as a part of and a commentary on the little demi-monde of poetry. All right, but you object. The movement into linguistic and institutional self-reflection may be one future of poetry, but surely, you say, that's not the whole future. Very well. I'm nothing if not accommodating, so I'm going to change my thesis, but I want to warn you, it's the last time. So this, it is difficult to predict the future of poetry, but two things are certain. It will be marginal and it will be everywhere. This sounds contradictory, but only until one accepts what demographers have come to accept as fact. There is no mainstream, there are only margins or identity groups. And each group has its politics, and along with these politics come a myriad of identity poetics. Poetry that sets out to articulate ethnic identity, gender identity, racial identity, disability identity, generational identity, regional identity, and sometimes even professional identity. Oh, the original of this talk has a little peroration here concerning cowboy poetry as professional poetry. It pained me to lose it, but we're moving on. This kind of poetry promises to grow with the increasing diversity of America and the need for new groups to claim their place and articulate their values. It is a far cry from art for its own sake, this identity articulation, and in some sense more vital for having greater reach. So if you don't like my earlier claim about the increasing specialization of poetry, let this latest thesis about the future of poetry warm your heart. Of course, my four theses are not mutually exclusive. In fact, each of them refers to an element of poetry's present and to contemporary activities that draw on different elements of the past: rhyme, of French symbolism, aesthetic autonomy, identity politics. And one thing is certain: in the future, poets will continue to find things in the past worth reviving. As for which things they'll find in the past to revive, we can't say for sure because it's difficult to predict the past. Thank you.
It's difficult to predict the past.
Yeah, I thought that was very clever when I wrote it. You know, I came up with it on the way into the talk at the Grolier Poetry Bookshop, which I remembered, Mark, I was trying to tell you earlier who I gave the talk with. It was Stephanie Burt at the time, going under Steve Burt, and it was Ben Mazer. It wasn't Philip Nikolaev. It was the other Boston Bohemian poet.
who told me that he's in on the thing today, but I don't see him on Zoom. He may be on Facebook or something. I'm sure you'll hear a couple of curses from him later. But yeah, so now it's time for Sally Connolly and Mark Scroggins to take Robert Archambeau down.
Good.
Hello, folks. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Bob, for the lead-in there. That was fascinating. So the future of poetry, it will rhyme. I will definitively rebuke and rebuff that assertion, but I think in the Q&A afterwards, because my talk today is concerned far more with the latter 3 points that Bob makes. It will be ubiquitous and elusive. It will be marginal and increasingly about itself, and it will be marginal and everywhere. And I think I can agree with all of those, so I won't be overtly, horribly vicious. But it is indeed hard to predict the past, but I'm going to be talking today about a type of poetry that uses the past to try and influence the future, and speculate about an important form of poetry that I think will become increasingly necessary and central to the poetry landscape in the future and in response to the turmoil of the current moment. Though it seems rather ridiculous to quote a famous fascist in the service of my argument, I'd like to remind you of Ezra Pound, who wrote these lines in Hugh Selwyn Mobley exactly 100 years ago. The age demanded an image of its accelerated grimace, something for the modern stage, not at any rate an Attic grace, not certainly the obscure reveries of the inward gaze, better mendacities than the classics in paraphrase. The age demanded chiefly a mould in plaster, made with no loss of time, a prose kinema, no, not assuredly alabaster, or the sculpture of rhyme. Of course, Pound intends this to be a critique of the poetry of his era, not a prescription for it. But I think 100 years later, we might do well with the idea of the copy, the mold in plaster, and with the directness of a prose kinema rather than the sculpture of rhyme. And as I said, Bob, I'm going to go after you about that in the Q&A. So what does our age, 100 years after Pound is writing this, demand? And what kind of poetry may best speak to unrest and injustice? And I would argue today, and I'm going to assert today, that that is in fact documentary poetics. So what exactly do I mean by documentary poetics? It is a very slippery and uncertain term. One of the best contemporary practitioners of the genre, I would argue, is Mark Novak, whose Coal Mountain Elementary is an excellent example of the genre that is concerned with the West Virginia Sago mining disaster and various mining disasters in China. And he writes, documentary poetics has no founder, no contested inception, no signature spokespersons claiming its cultural capital. Its practice is not limited to the pre-modern, modernist, or postmodern moments, not so much a movement as a modality within poetry, whose range I see along a continuum from the first-person auto-ethnographic mode of inscription to a more objective third-person documentarian tendency, with practitioners located at points all across the continuum. Broadly understood, it means poetry that takes up, considers, and represents, or rather represents, current or past events. It often draws on the technique of documentary filmmaking, much like the prose kinema that Pound so distastefully describes and decried, and is frequently politically motivated, inclining often towards the left. Though you could, in fact, sort of argue that Cantos is a proto-documentary poem with right-wing politics. It often uses found materials in this documentary manner. This is not a lyrical form of poetry invested in the personal eye. It's a far more communitarian mode of bearing witness. Thus, though, for example, I'd rate Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American lyric, as one of the most important books of poetry in the past decade, and though that poem draws on her own and other contemporaries' experiences of racism, I wouldn't consider it a documentary poetics. And indeed, Rankine is drawing attention to the notion and indeed the problematic nature of lyricism to interrogate the central tension in her work. The documentary then is a poetics fundamentally predicated upon events in the past. For example, Muriel Rukeyser's The Book of the Dead, the predominantly African-American miners of the Hawk's Nest tunnel disaster, dying of silicosis of the lungs, and her book about that. Or Charles Reznikoff's Holocaust, which draws on excerpts from the Nuremberg and Eichmann trials. Or M. Nobesi Phillips's Zong, a poetic redaction of transcripts, the transcript of Gregson versus Gilbert, the legal text, the legal case that involved the owners of the slave ship Zong trying to claim insurance for the 150 slaves that they themselves had drowned. And I quote from Phillips, quoting from the trial, "Captain Luke Collingwood is of the belief that if the African slaves on board die a natural death, the owners of the ship will have to bear the cost. But if they are thrown alive into the sea, it would be the loss of the underwriters." So these documentary poems are poems that are predicated upon the past, but with an eye to affecting the future and affecting change in the future. So documentary poetics are activist and political poetics. And thus I think, or rather I hope, they will be central to the current and the coming era of unrest. But then what of my old friend Auden's assertion in his elegy for Yeats that poetry makes nothing happen? I know Bob has thought long and hard on this as well. Auden was to expand upon the idea that poetry makes nothing happen twice in the year that followed the publication of In Memory of W.B. Yeats. In a prose essay, The Public versus the Late Mr. William Butler Yeats, the defense counsel informs the jury, and I quote, "Art is a product of history, not a cause. It does not re-enter history as an effective agent." While in his New Year letter, which was published in 1940, Auden asserts, and I quote again, "Art in intention is mimesis, but realize the resemblance ceases. Art is not life and cannot be a midwife to society." Paul Muldoon certainly agrees with this assessment in his poem, 7 Madar Street, where the character of Auden states, "For history's a twisted root, and art its small translucent fruit, and never the other way around." Much as I love both Auden and Muldoon, I think they're dead wrong, and I hope they're dead wrong. I think it's wishful thinking, a way of abdicating moral responsibility and hiding behind aesthetics. Auden probably repeatedly overstates his case about the power of poetry, or rather the lack thereof, since he was worried, as was Yeats, about how his poetry could and maybe had influenced his readership. I mean, this is the reason that he appends the date 1937 to his poem Spain, when he writes about, justified murder. So he wants to remove himself from the scene. So if poetry can make something happen, what in particular can documentary poetics make happen? I think of William Carlos Williams' Asphodel, that greeny flower. Of course, it's a very famous quote. "Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." What is found there, or, as I'd argue in the case of documentary poetics, what is found? But nothing is ever just found. It is selected, curated, presented for effect. The finder is also a maker. And here is the point at which documentary poetics must proceed with extreme caution. Many of the most controversial recent debates in poetry have been about cultural appropriation and consider who has the right to write. For example, the furore that ensued when Anderson Carlson Wee's poem How To was published in The Nation. Carlson Wee is of course white, and the poem provoked outrage for the manner in which it appropriates African-American vernacular. There was an uproar, and the editors issued an apology, and then a Twitter storm ensued. Stephen King, rather missing the point, opined, "What next? Apologies for women who write from the male point of view, or vice versa." Roxane Gay, as she so wonderfully often does, smacked back, replying to Stephen King, "It is not that a white man used black vernacular, it's that he did it badly and inconsistently, and that is a problem. It demonstrates a lack of nuance and understanding about blackness, and now, more than anything, we need nuance and understanding, Mr. King." This doesn't mean that we can only write about our respective races, of course, But Gay is absolutely right about nuance and understanding. And I'd propose documentary poetics as one of the best ways to achieve this. And yet, documentary poetics is particularly appropriative in its very nature. And here again, we enter very difficult territory. Consider, for example, the disgust that rightly greeted Kenneth Goldsmith's 2015 performance of his poem, The Autopsy of Michael Brown. Goldsmith, of course, is one of the most famous of the crop of the conpo, or conceptual poets. He's famous for works, I mean, I'm sure most of you know, but just in case those of you that don't, he's famous for works such as Day, in which he transcribes the entirety, word for word, of one day's New York Times. He freely admits, and these are quotes directly from Goldsmith, he is the most boring writer who ever lived and horrible to read. When asked if your work is boring and horrible to read, why are you invited to the White House? He responded, because I'm a charismatic performer, my work is unreadable, but it's performable. Goldsmith delights in being provocative, so I'd rather not be dignifying his output with interest. However, I am using him now as a how not to proceed example for documentary poetics. Marjorie Perloff, who I think has also problematically defended Goldsmith's appropriation of Michael Brown's autopsy report by saying that Brown was scary and anyhow didn't have much of a family or a life. Those are her exact words, as recorded by Jen Hoffer at a conference in Denmark. Perloff, who's Goldsmith's biggest cheerleader, coined the clever term unoriginal genius for Goldsmith et al.'s oeuvre. And she's not wrong, but the problem is that unoriginal genius is only a genius if you're the one who originates the concept. And all Goldsmith seems to be doing is ripping off all of Andy Warhol's maneuvers in a fancy paisley suit. The Autopsy of Michael Brown was a work that served as a postscript to Goldsmith's 7 American Deaths and Disasters book of 2013, which is, of course, an idea that predictably originates from Warhol's original idea. Goldsmith thought that the autopsy report of a murdered 18-year-old would make a fitting companion to his earlier poems that draw on eyewitness accounts of the deaths of JFK, Bobby Kennedy, John Lennon, Michael Jackson, the dead of the Challenger disaster, the Columbine shooting, and 9/11. He performed the poem at Brown University to immediate and justified outrage. The problem is that the poem, drawing on documentary materials, is not about the atrocity committed on the person of Michael Brown. Rather, it is about Goldsmith performing his own poethood. I'd call this poetic ploy ego poetics. This is also the problem with the arch and ironic persona deployed by Vanessa Place. Both of these poets rely upon the unlyrical appropriation of found materials that only exist as poems when filtered through the prism of the poet's persona or performance. So how can documentary poetics avoid this? I'd like to finish by considering a few recent examples of documentary poetics done right. And because time is short, I'd like to focus on one particular aspect that acts as an effective bulwark against the problems that Goldsmith's and Place's work present us with. That is, their polyvocality and antiphonal qualities, which I think are extremely redeeming. This is, of course, not something new in documentary poetics. We see it already in Ruckhiser's Book of the Dead in 1938, and in the various acts of testimony in Reznikov's Holocaust. I do think, however, that the documentary works that our age demands must be multivocal and thus achieve the nuance and understanding that Roxane Gay was calling for. In her fascinating Afterword to Zong, which was published in 2008, M. Nobesi Phillips writes, and I quote from her, "It came upon me one day that the fugue, in both meanings of the word, was a frame through which I could understand Zong. In the musical sense of the word, Zong is a counterpointed fugal anti-narrative in which several strands are simultaneously at work. In the classic fugal form, the theme is stated, then reiterated in a second, third, and subsequent voices. In a similar fashion, Zong is a sustained repetition or reiteration of various themes, phrases, and voices, albeit fragmented." She then goes on to describe the poem as a fugal palimpsest, which I think is an excellent model for future documentary poets to follow. We see this fugal palimpsest, for example, in Mark Novak's excellent 2009 poem that I mentioned earlier, Coal Mountain Elementary, which combines testimony of the survivors of the West Virginia Sago mine disaster with new newspaper accounts of mining disasters in China, along with, frankly, propagandist materials published by the Coal Council of America and photographs of miners and mining in America and China. We see this fugal palimpsest too in Henk Rousseau's recent and excellent epic poem, Camisa. Full disclosure, Henk is a former poet, a former student of mine. If you haven't read his work though, and I say this not because I am biased, because it's true, his work is truly excellent. And you must read it. Camisa is a creative tour de force that is grounded in the topography and history of Henk's hometown, Cape Town, in South Africa. The title is taken from the name of the possibly apocryphal original port settlement upon which the latter-day Cape Town was founded, and the text echoes with voices, different languages, and fragments of text. In particular, Henk draws on the colonial archive of the VOC company and considers the way in which his Huguenot ancestors, and by extension himself, are implicated in apartheid. For as Henk explains as he looks over the colonial archive, I recognized my own hand in the document. And he names one of his central protagonists, Pieter Fore, after my grandfather, as a proxy figure, both for myself and for my Huguenot ancestors, French immigrants eager to benefit from slavery, in an act that interrogates the complicity of his own whiteness. So this talk was not meant to be a repudiation or diminution of lyrical protest poetry, poetry that I have in recent days repeatedly drawn on and read and reposted. And I'm thinking of excellent poems like Dennis Smith's Dear White America, or Jericho Brown's Bullet Points, or Harriet Mullins's We Are Not Responsible. I do, however, think that a poetics of protest with an agenda of truth and reconciliation is perhaps best served by the communitarian agenda of documentary poetics that help us, if not predict the future, at least learn from the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
So, shall we learn from the past? What do you think, Robert Archambeau? Can we learn from the past? I'll mute you. There we go.
Oh, I'm speaking now?
Yeah.
Can we learn from the past? God, I hope so. I mean, that's how I make my living, you know, is teaching 19th century poetry. Of course we can learn from the past. You know, we don't have much access to the future yet, so it's one of a very limited number of options for us.
So what do we learn, let's say, from Shelley?
Well, Shelley is, I feel a little soundbitey like this, but you know, Shelley's a great poet for our moment, right? Shelley is a poet of radicalism living in a time of apparent utter loss of all revolutionary ideals, right? Living when the revolution in France has been utterly crushed by Napoleonic imperialism, living in the wake of the Peterloo massacre and other terrible events in England, living at a time when the hopes of enlightenment-informed revolution had largely been dashed. And he's admirable to the point of absurdity in keeping the faith, you know? How do you not learn from Shelley in Trump's America? That's the end of my soundbite.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
Let's hear from Mark Scroggins. What you got to say, Mark?
Well, can you hear me first?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to sit back a little because I've had one of those first world gardening accidents and am sort of covered with a horrible poison ivy rash from head to toe, and I look rather like Michael Gambon in the Singing detective and feel a little better. And I think I'm running a fever, so what I have to say may be feverish, and it's certainly far less coherent or formal than what Bob and Sally have had to present. And this whole business about the future of poetry. I left the academy myself about 4.5 years ago, and I thought that once I no longer had any formal obligation to think about poetry, past, present, or future, that I'd stop wondering about where poetry was headed and pay attention to sort of the only poetry whose direction I had any control over, which was my own. But rather surprisingly, over the last few months, I have taken on this monthly gig for Hyperallergic Weekly, writing about poetry, and I'm finding this small mountain of review copies piling up in the front hall, and I have actually been thinking about the situation of poetry. So on the other hand, I have been reading fairly intensely lately in ecclesiastical history and Christian doctrine and other sort of obscure things. I'm not a religious person, but and of course, we think of the person who predicts the future, of course, as a prophet, right? And this made me think about a verse from the Epistle to the Hebrews, which was impressed upon me much in Sunday school when I was a tyke, about what happened to the prophets. Some were tried by mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, by bonds, imprisonment. They were stoned, they were hewn asunder, they were slain with the sword, they wandered up and down in sheepskins, etc., which impressed me as being an indication that being a prophet, telling the future, is kind of a mug's game, that it can get you into bad places. And I much preferred a verse from the Gospel according to Joe Strummer, right? The future is unwritten. Now, we can think about the future of poetry in a couple of different ways. We can look around at what poetry is now, and we can think about the changes that poetry has gone through from where it was before now to where it is now. Okay. And this dovetails kind of nicely with what Sally was talking about, because she was talking very much about books like Claudia Rankine and Norbese Phillips and Hank Rousseau, all of which books I agree with her are entirely excellent. But when I read those books, I don't necessarily see the future of poetry. I see poetry's past made present. That is to say, what I see at the stock in trade of the contemporary poetry scene is a series of gestures and formal strategies and conceptual strategies which were considered radical and unpoetic some 80 years ago. Right? And we think about Rukeyser, we think about Reznikov. Those books were not particularly well received at the time. We think about the moment in William Carlos Williams's Patterson, where Mike Wallace is interviewing him. He says, "Can you just put a list and make it a poem?" And William says, "Why, yes, you can." So documentary poetics is not a new thing, but it is a newly respectable thing. within the last 10, 15 years. Large chunks of quoted source texts are not a new thing. We can date them back to the Malatesta cantos, to quote that the evil fascist, if we like. They are not a new thing, but they are stock in trade now. The hybrid text in general is not a new thing. We can think back to Williams in the 20s with Cora and Hell and Spring and all. We can think back to multiple generic things by Gertrude Stein. We can talk about erasure poetics, which is, at least in American poetry, is what, 44 years old this year, inaugurated with Ronald Johnson's radios. And now it's become stock in trade of the workshop. Okay, it has all been, it has become part of the idiom. So I'm not sure we can look for the future of poetry in the things which are accepted as poetic now. And I not to get all religious on you, but let me quote another verse where Jesus in I think in all of the synoptics, he cites Psalm 119. The stone which the builders refused, the same is made the head of the corner. Okay, which is to say, Johnson, for instance, with Erasure Poetics, was widely jeered at in the 70s and through the 80s. This was not poetry, just as Mike Wallace is laughing at Williams at incorporating a laundry list or a grocery list or what have you into his poetry. In Patterson, those things have become the idiom of today. So I would propose as one possible future for poetry, one of many futures for poetry, and that the most rebarbative, the most unpoetic, that which you are most inclined to be repelled by rather than attracted to in contemporary writing, that may well be a future for poetry because it's happened before, right? I like Brian Reed came out with a book 8 or 9 years ago in which he argued that the only two valid avant-gardes in American poetry in the old sense were Flarf. Remember the Google mining, I'm never really serious poetry, which flourished for a decade or so, and conceptual poetry. And he argued that they were so because they were the only sorts of writing which questioned the grounds of what poetry itself was. So I propose several possible futures for poetry, maybe a Flarf future for poetry, maybe a conceptual future for poetry, maybe a Rupi Kaur-like Insta. I know, I'm sorry, Sally. Sally actually is Rupi Kaur's biggest fan. An Instagram future for poetry, okay? However, most talk, well, when you talk about the future, you are by definition speculating, right? And when you speculate on the future, you're getting into money guy territory, hedge fund territory. So we're talking about futures markets in poetry, aren't we? Okay, and that's what you get when most people who are talking about the future of poetry are doing. They're advancing bets on a particular future, right? are you, Mark, are you telling me to slow down or to stop? Or no? Or yes.
I was advancing bets, actually.
Oh, very good. So most of the people who talk to you about the future of poetry and who say this is the future of poetry have a particular interest. They are invested in a particular future, in trying to make that happen one way or the other. Me, I'm back there with St. Joe. The future is unwritten. The only future in poetry that I'm interested in writing is the next few movements of my long poem, frankly. But I will offer, in Bob's spirit, a few futures for poetry of which I'm fairly confident. Number one, it will never again be widely popular in a Tennysonian sense, if it ever was. Okay, too many different competitions, too many other things happening. Number two, and this is a variation on two of your points, Bob, language used in a poetic manner will continue to be ubiquitous. And three, people will continue to write, perform, and share poetry in deeply emotional, thoughtful, and committed ways, even if as a subculture. So should I wind it up there? I could make another set of points, but I think that's okay, right?
I do. What I would like to see now is you and Sally to take down Bob.
Okay.
Oh, take down Bob. Okay, well, let me, you see, Bob and I, we're very different in the sense that we pinpointed the difference between the two of us in a conversation the other day, which is to say, Bob's favorite Miles albums are, Bob?
Working and Cooking, the two of the 4 albums that he made to get out of his contract with Prestige Records, which are really just Miles and the best band in the history of jazz setting up for an afternoon and recording and being astonishingly tight and wonderful together. Mark, the heretic that he is in every sense of the word, likes the things that come after Bitches Brew when it's, and I say this as a descriptive rather than a judgmental term, hot fucking mess. That's what he likes.
Yes, hot fucking mess. The sidelong, unstructured 2-chord jams.
So you think the future of poetry is jazz?
That's a really grim prognosis, Sally.
I would like to talk about rhyme a bit, if that's all right with everybody.
Sure.
Around. So in the fall of last year, I taught a course about poems about catastrophe, atrocity, disease, disaster, and blight. And that was a cheerful time. But one of the things that we did look at was the capacity for rhyming verse, or the failure thereof, to be able to approach and broach these subjects. And what I did was I started the year off by us all reading William McGonagall's dreadful poem, about the Tay Bridge disaster. I'm sure you're all familiar with this verse atrocity. And talking about how, and obviously McGonagall is a terrible poet to start with, but talking about how rhyme seems particularly ill-suited to treating that sort of subject matter. And I was wondering, I sort of posited it as a hypothesis. It wasn't necessarily something that I was wedded to or invested in. But then as the semester progressed, it definitely seemed as if there was something coming unstuck with rhyme in the face of catastrophe. And I wonder how much, and I do take your point about the ubiquity of rhyme. And of course, we're talking about a very particular sort of rhyme when you're talking about rap and hip hop, but I don't think that rhyme will stand up to the onslaught of current events. And I mean, for example, if you even look at, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Simon Armitage's dreadful poem, 9/11 poem called Out of the Blue, or for example, Craig Rain's AIDS elegy, à la recherche du temps perdu, where the immortal, I think it's one of the worst lines of poetry I've ever read, when he's writing about his former lover and she's subsequently died of AIDS, and he writes,
have you ever read any Yoko Ono?
Well, I've got to give you this line, Mark, because it's so appalling. But he writes, "À la recherche du temps perdu, your favorite book beside the loo." I mean, it's just appalling. So I wonder if there is something that rhyme is crumbling in the face of the welter and onslaught of modern experience. But you're absolutely right, though, that the objection will be allowed. But what about, for example, rap music? Like, the best response I've seen thus far to the coronavirus pandemic is Todrick Hall's reworking of his Mask, Gloves, Soap, Scrubs. Have any of you seen this? The original is called, Nails, Hair, Hips, Heels. But he's done a version called Mask, Gloves, Soap, Scrubs, which has some of the best rhymes I've seen in years. This, for example, is one of the stanzas from the beginning of it. Kitty cat cat, tell me Carol Baskin, where is the husband everyone's asking? Stimulus check, everybody better cash in. Mask and gloves, yeah, that's the new fashion. So what is going on with, I mean, I put it out there. It's something that I'm thinking about at the moment, and I'd really love to hear the opinions of the Zoom room.
Anyone like to chime in at this stage?
Are you talking to me and Mark, or are you talking to?
Well, let's call in the rest of the folks. Why not? Anyone who would like to?
So I'll unmute someone if they hit yes in the chat room in the participants window. If you'll pull up the participants window, you have the opportunity to press like yes or no, or give us some sort of reaction. And if I see some sort of reaction, I'll go ahead and unmute you so that you can give a question. It looks like Jonathan Mayhew has something to say. Let me unmute him. Jonathan, did you want to say what you said in the chat? We can hear you now, Jonathan. Okay, Madeline just raised her hand. So let me see here. Ask to unmute.
Uh-oh.
Hi?
Hi.
Yes. I don't write in form, and I don't write with bad rhymes or good rhymes. My poems do not have the master of rhyme because it's very, very hard to put a good rhyme in and not have it be tacked on, that feel. My poem has to have its own truth, that be its master. That's how I feel. Rap is very different. You know, the end of each line has that rhyme, and then you see it in commercials and everything, and then the kids are all shouting out. The next line's got that, you know, the rhyme. That's music. That's more music, and certainly poetry is musical, but I don't feel that most poets can use rhyme to the best advantage of the truth of the poem.
Okay, thank you, Madeline. But let's get back to the core of the matter. So, guys, Mark, Bob, Sally, you know, what are we going to see in the next 10 years? What do you think?
I have no idea. I'm no prophet, but I would want to single Sally out on that phrase, the pound phrase she cited, the age demanded.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the whole notion of the age demanding a particular thing. Our age demands, this age demands, the situation demands. And I would steer you back to the original that sounds condescending. Sorry. I would steer us back to the original context of that phrase in Hugh Selwyn Moberly, where Pound is saying the age demands a prose kinema made with no loss of time, which is in essence the opposite of what Pound himself is advancing as a poetics.
Yes.
Right? So you see, Hugh Selwyn Moberly is about resisting the age's demands.
Which I did say, but I think that what Pound reviles, in fact, is going to be useful for our current era. But again, I don't. It's not my stock in trade to prognosticate about where poetry's going. I'm a close reader, but as far as I'm concerned, I think that for what it's worth, that documentary poetics is maybe our best hope in the face of what we're currently dealing with.
But it's a funny way to talk about poetry as being our.
I have to say I'm laughing because I had a kind of a betting pool on when Mark Scroggins would sputter in incomprehending outrage, and we finally hit it at 5:16. I lose, Valerie wins. Carry on.
We always knew Valerie was the smart one.
Oh.
Go on.
You were sputtering, Mark.
I was sputtering. Our best hope for what? And how will poetry help us?
Well, I mean, the nature of the task we've been set to talk about the future of poetry is, what is poetry responding to, or at least that's the way that I took it. Maybe it's because I'm thinking very much of the current moment and how I imagine poetry might. That might be a product of my own research myopia, because I'm, interested in poetic treatments of atrocity and disaster.
Please, Robert.
Yeah, I have a chiasmus, which I would like to drop. It's not what is poetry responding to that you want to look at if you want to look at the future. It's not what is poetry responding to. It's who is responding to poetry. I mean,
correct.
Mark was offering this kind of the last shall be first vision of poetry. That which is reviled shall be praised, which is a sort of an old avant-gardist view. Like the fact that no one likes us is proof that we're going to be adored, right? Which is a bad kind of history, because a lot of things that begin reviled remain reviled. Sally was talking about McGonagall. The whole 19th century school of spasmodic poetry began as despised and is despised now. You've never heard of it unless you read about it as a joke, right? But what happens is who is responding to poetry and what institutions are there to harbor it and foster it change. And those institutions often have a big filtering and selecting process, a role. And I think one thing that's going to be really interesting is what happens to poetry when the academic humanities are finally completely gutted, which I think is a likely prediction. I'm not happy about it, right? But the academe has for several generations been the primary home for poetry in American life. That's been a just, correct cause of criticism, right? But yep. Poetry has largely in where it's funded and where the people who do it are located, in how it's written and who chooses it, has largely been academic, for better and for worse. Sure. That may be coming to an end as a dominant force, and that will affect what kind of poems are sought out and cared for. That may or may not happen. Maybe there's going to be a great revival of poetry in academe. Let us pray, right? But I think it's likely that if academe sort of sputters and dies as a home and shelter for poetry, then I think we'll see much more of poetry that speaks to identity groups being even more elevated. It's strong now. I think it could be stronger. Poetry that speaks especially for the disenfranchised. There's a scholar of Irish literature, and I've never known if his last name is pronounced Kibbard or Kybert. Declan Kybert, I'm going to say. Wrote a great book called Inventing Ireland, size of a tombstone. And he addressed in the middle of this the question as to why poetry in Ireland has been, or at least in the early 20th century, was more popular held in greater public esteem than in many other countries. And he said, look, if you've been in a colonized situation and you want to see your values expressed, you can't look at your flag, you can't look at your military, you can't look at your educational system, you can't look at your governance, which is dominated by people from elsewhere. But poetry it's a low entry cost. You know, you don't need a movie studio, you need a pen. And poetry often becomes a place where those who feel disenfranchised gain a kind of expression. And, you know, that may be where we find poetry thriving, especially if there's a kind of collapse of the poetic academic complex, which has been very good for a number of things. It's been really good for things that call out for a lot of analysis and commentary, you know. I remember, you know, when, is Alan Golding still on? You know, he was here, he was the host forever of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture, which is heavily dominated by poetry. And I remember that conference in the 90s as an academic conference, going there. I would go there every year just to have front row seats for the rise of language poetry, because it was really, it slotted in nicely with what academe was doing at the time, which is not to discredit it, but that was a big part of its rise. So, you know, cherchez lecture, find where the readers are and find what institutions they have mediating between them and the poems, and you'll find the future of poetry.
Bob,
yeah.
I have nothing substantive to respond to what you just said, which was absolutely on target, but I do have to respond because you began by taking a cat swipe at me.
I did, exactly, yes.
For what you called bad history.
Oh dear,
Yeah.
I surrender.
I did not say the first shall be last. Or the last shall be first. I said that maybe it sometimes works out that
Oh,
way.
you're like me.
Mathematics are still under there.
You're speaking as a coward and an academic and hedging your bets like I do. Well done. Yes.
I'm a cowardly ex-academic. Right? No, and I'm speaking as, again, an acolyte of St. Joe Strummer. The future is unwritten. We cannot know, right? I speak as someone who goes to a fantasy and science fiction conference every year as a speculativist, right?
I'm going to interject here and say that we have an extended day today. So we don't want to miss out on our open mics and all that. Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Mark. As you can see, the future of poetry is crystal clear. Back to Larissa.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much. Sally, Robert, Mark, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm sitting here in my Zoom with my futuristi, and I hated the civilists. Just anyway. I would like to thank Sally Connolly, Robert Archambeau, and Mark Scroggins for a stimulating discussion, for a wide-ranging and brilliant discussion that has raised us many questions, and provided some very interesting answers. Thank you. Thank you, critics. Thank you for your heuristics. Thank you for your love of poetry, that you study it, that you cherish it, that you devote such thought and energy to it, that your role is enormously important, dear critics, enormously important. All right, so anyway, we're moving on to the next phase of our show, which is the open mic. I would like to shout out a thank you to our wonderful technical director, Tanya Woods, for keeping us safe from Zoom bombers today. Everybody, please give Tanya a hand. Thank you so very much. I'd like to let you know about upcoming shows of Lit Balm. On June 13th, we have Patricia Spears-Jones, Dean Costos, and Richard Jeffrey Newman. And on June 20th, we have a special Irish edition of Lit Balm. We will be featuring Aidan Rooney, Mary O'Donoghue, and Daniel Tobin. Be sure to come back. All right, let's do the open mic. Madeline, you have a documentary poem for us. Let's hear it.
Yes, hi. I was a photojournalist with a press pass, and so I call this I used to call this a photojournalistic poem, and that may be what they were talking about as a documentary poem. But here it is: American in Cuba, 1989. At the Museo Bellas Artes Havana, preschoolers tell me their families bring them here often. Everywhere, girls and women like strutting bouquets in hand-sewn cotton dresses. Boys and men, heads under hoods of 50s American cars, breathing deep the smells of Miami. I stroll near the hotel, arm myself with "No me moleste" and "Policía, ayúdame, por favor." A dark-skinned young man approaches, speaks little English. I understand him to say, "Need your help, don't want your money, give you my pesos for dollars. Good things only in dollar stores, please, pretty lady." He shows me his ration coupons, hardly enough, begs me to help him. I am considering his request when La Policia swoop out, slam him into a wall, ask for his papers, my passport, and whether he's bothering me. "No problema," I say, but they drag him off. He calls out, "I just wanted to talk to you."
Thank you. Thank you today, Madeline. Thank you for thank you for your poem today, Madeline.
Thank
All right, next up we have Ace Mulvaville. Are you here, Ace?
I don't see that name. Oh, there it is. Excuse me. Okay. Asking to unmute Ace. There we go.
Okay. All right, thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. I was happy to listen and participate in this way. So it's a great job you guys are all doing. And when Larissa suggested I read a poem, I looked through my poems and ones that were published and the ones that are unpublished and thought, gee, the times are so bizarre. I need to talk about them and read what's going on now. So this is a poem that I guess could be called timely. My friends no longer talk to me about trees or robins, afraid that the words will slide to Trump and Black lives and how they matter and when. My cousin called to ask hello and how was I? And then, embarrassed, said, "You know, I kind of like this president." And my friend Rob, from age 16, called and mentioned, "I only watch Fox News. All else is fake." I'm not afraid of these folks, or that I knew them so long during formative years when we were not yet men. I wonder where they got these views to see Black lives and protests so different from how it's shown in my eyes. This afternoon, a sudden storm appeared. Heavy, heavy rain, blasts of lightning, thunder, drum rolls. The kind of storm that once smelled of summer camp with a boy in a forest tent. But now the mind runs to global warming and the puzzle, is this storm exceptional or is it just rain? These thoughts like miracle evaporation, a dish filled with water sucked dry by the geranium, or disappearing in warm sun air, changed to gas invisible and present, a state we don't recognize, floating airless, untouchable, tint the future, pretending that history no longer repeats.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ace. Thank you for your poem.
Okay.
Rodney A. Brown, would you like to come up to the mic and give us a poem?
I'm unmuting Rodney. Let's see, I hit S to unmute Rodney. Can you unmute now? Cool.
You there, Rodney?
Rodney, did Rodney successfully rejoin us?
I guess he's having tech problems.
Perhaps over in Denmark, would Henry King like to grace us with a poem? Is that
That
possible?
would be nice. We have a visitor from Denmark. That would be wonderful. Mr. King, would you give us a poem?
Let me find and unmute Mr. King.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Let me see what I've got lying around. My level of production has been low recently, so this is a villanelle that I banged out recently, and it's based on Basil Bunting's suggestions for how one ought to go about improving your poems. You might have seen his list of what you ought to do, which is called I Suggest. So the poem is called Suggestion. Put your poem away till you forget it. Then, said Bunting, cut out every word you dare. Do it again a week later and again. Although the sheets took time to escape my ken, I followed the advice he chose to share. Put your poem away till you forget it. Then I found it looking for a missing pen and had to cut the words out with a pair of scissors. A week later, and again, I'm up all evening editing. At 10, my wife steps in, implying with a stare, put your poem away till you forget it then. In our apartment's courtyard, the bin men remove great heaps of scrap I leave out there. Do it again a week later, and again. After months following this regimen, the habit's all that's left. I reach despair, put my poem away till I forget it, then do it again a week later, and again.
Thank you, Henry. Fantastic.
Thank you. That's wonderful. All right. I think that is a wrap for our show tonight.
Can we try Rodney again?
Oh, is Rodney back? Rodney A. Brown, are you here with us? Did you unmute him?
No luck. Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
All right. Next time.
Next time, we'll definitely get you next time, Rodney. I swear to God. Okay. Anyway, once again, many thanks to Robert Archambeau, to Sally Connolly, and to Mark Scroggins for a wonderful, wonderful discussion today. And thanks to the Black Lives Matter protesters who guard the diversity and freedom of thought, which is necessary for academia and which is our very survival as academicians, those of us who are. Mark, Jonathan, you have anything you want to say in coda?
Well, I'd love to say, Bob, you just began the conversation.
That's pretty much true. Jonathan?
Oh, no, thank you, though.
All right, good enough. All right, we will love like dogwood, kiss like cranes, die like moths. I promise that's our show. Good night. Thank you. Come next week when we have Patricia Spears-Jones, Dean Costos, and Richard Jeffrey Newman. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Good night.
Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.